The china teacup fell from trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the mansion's grand foyer. But it wasn't the crash that made the blood drain from 26-year-old heiress Victoria Sterling's face. It was the sight of Maria Santos, the family's loyal housekeeper, collapsing to her knees beside the broken porcelain, a strange, peaceful smile spreading across her weathered features, even as foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. The tea had been meant for someone else entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria's stepmother, the elegant and seemingly untouchable Catherine Sterling, was supposed to be the one drinking from that delicate cup. Instead, Maria lay dying on the floor, her dark eyes finding Victoria's in those final moments. And impossibly, unbelievably, she was still smiling. What secret could make a woman smile in the face of death? What truth was so powerful that it could turn a moment of tragedy into something that looked almost like triumph? The story you're about to hear is one of buried secrets, twisted family loyalties, and a discovery so shocking it would expose the dark heart beating beneath one of New York's most respected dynasties. The Sterling mansion perched on its manicured hillside in the exclusive enclave of Greenwich, Connecticut, like a monument to old money and older secrets. Built in the 1920s by Victoria's great-grandfather, the sprawling Tudor revival estate commanded views of Long Island Sound and had hosted presidents, foreign dignitaries, and titans of industry within its stone walls. To the outside world, it represented everything admirable about American success and refinement. To Victoria Sterling, it had always felt more like an elaborate prison. Victoria had been born into privilege but raised on disappointment. Her father, Robert Sterling, was the third-generation heir to Sterling Industries, a shipping and logistics empire that had made the family fortune by moving goods across oceans and continents. He was a man of tremendous business acumen, but limited emotional capacity, someone who could navigate the complexities of international trade, but seemed perpetually mystified by the simple act of loving his own daughter. Her mother, Elizabeth, had died when Victoria was only 8 years old. The official cause was a riding accident, a tragic fall from her favorite horse during a morning ride through the estate's extensive grounds. But even as a child, Victoria had sensed there were whispers among the staff, hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. Her mother had been struggling with depression. The servants would murmur when they thought no one was listening. She had been taking medication, seeing doctors. The accident, some suggested in carefully coded language, might not have been entirely accidental. Robert Sterling had grieved in the way wealthy men often do, throwing himself into his work with an almost manic intensity, while delegating the practical matter of raising his daughter to a succession of nannies and boarding schools. Victoria learned early that love, in the Sterling household, was conditional and scarce. Achievement was rewarded with distant approval. Failure was met with cold disappointment. Emotional needs were treated as inconveniences to be managed by hired help. When Victoria was 16, her father had returned from a business trip to London with a surprise. Catherine Morrison, a striking British woman 20 years his junior, would be joining their family as his new wife. Catherine was everything Victoria's mother had not been, polished where Elizabeth had been natural, calculating where Elizabeth had been spontaneous, coldly beautiful where Elizabeth had been warmly lovely. The wedding had been a small, elegant affair held in the mansion's rose garden. Victoria had stood at her father's side in a pale blue dress, watching as he pledged his love to a woman who looked at her new stepdaughter with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating potential competition. From that moment, Victoria understood that her already tenuous position in her father's affections had become even more precarious. Catherine had wasted no time in establishing her dominance over the household. She redecorated the mansion, replacing Elizabeth's warm lived-in touches with stark museum-quality pieces that discouraged comfort or casual use. She hired new staff members loyal to her, while gradually encouraging the departure of long-time employees who remembered Victoria's mother too fondly. She inserted herself seamlessly into Robert's business affairs, attending board meetings and networking events with a sophisticated charm that impressed his colleagues and friends. Most significantly, Catherine had begun the subtle but persistent campaign to marginalize Victoria within her own family. She never openly criticized or confronted her stepdaughter. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, she employed a more sophisticated arsenal of psychological warfare. She would schedule important family events when Victoria was away at college, ensuring she felt excluded from major decisions. She would redirect conversations away from Victoria's interests and achievements, subtly diminishing her presence in group settings. She would offer backhanded compliments that sounded supportive on the surface, but carried undertones of criticism and disappointment. Over the years, Victoria had watched her father transform under Catherine's influence. The distant but generally benevolent man who had raised her became increasingly cold and critical. Catherine had a talent for framing Victoria's actions in the worst possible light, presenting herself as the reasonable adult trying to guide a difficult and ungrateful stepdaughter. When Victoria struggled academically during her sophomore year at Yale, Catherine had convinced Robert that it was due to laziness and poor character, rather than the depression and anxiety that actually plagued her. When Victoria had briefly dated a fellow student whose family background was deemed insufficiently prestigious, Catherine had orchestrated the relationship's demise by spreading carefully chosen gossip about the young man's supposed character flaws. By the time Victoria graduated with her degree in art history, she felt like a stranger in her own home. Catherine had succeeded in creating an environment where Victoria's very presence felt like an intrusion. Family dinners became tense affairs where conversation flowed around her as if she weren't there. Business discussions that had once included her, at least peripherally, now took place behind closed doors. Even the household staff, many of whom had known her since childhood, began treating her with a careful formality that suggested they had been instructed to maintain professional distance. The only person in the mansion who continued to treat Victoria with genuine warmth was Maria Santos. Maria had been the Sterling family's housekeeper for nearly 15 years, arriving as a young widow from El Salvador seeking work to support her 3 children back home. She had been hired by Victoria's mother, who had seen something special in the quiet, dignified woman with calloused hands and intelligent eyes. Over the years, Maria had become far more than an employee. She had been a confidant to Elizabeth Sterling during her darkest periods, a surrogate mother figure to Victoria after Elizabeth's death, and a keeper of family secrets that stretched back decades. Maria was a small, compact woman in her early 50s with graying hair she kept pulled back in a neat bun and hands that never seemed to rest. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, appearing whenever needed, anticipating problems before they arose, maintaining the impossible standards of cleanliness and order that Catherine demanded. But unlike the other staff members, Maria had never allowed Catherine to intimidate her into betraying old loyalties. She continued to care for Victoria with a maternal protectiveness that had become one of the few sources of genuine warmth in the young woman's life. It was Maria who remembered Victoria's favorite foods and made sure they appeared on the menu when she visited home from college. It was Maria who quietly mended Victoria's clothes and kept her childhood bedroom exactly as she liked it, despite Catherine's suggestions that the space should be converted to a more practical use. It was Maria who listened without judgment when Victoria needed to talk about her struggles with depression, her complicated feelings about her father, and her growing certainty that she would never truly belong in the world she had been born into. Most importantly, it was Maria who had known Elizabeth Sterling intimately and who carried memories of Victoria's mother that Catherine seemed determined to erase. In quiet moments when the two women were alone, Maria would share stories about Elizabeth's kindness, her creativity, her fierce love for her daughter. These conversations were precious to Victoria, small acts of rebellion against Catherine's systematic campaign to rewrite the family's emotional history. Catherine, for her part, seemed to understand that Maria represented a threat to her carefully constructed narrative. The housekeeper was a living link to the previous Mrs. Sterling, a reminder of the family dynamic that had existed before Catherine's arrival. More dangerously, Maria was someone whose loyalty could not be purchased or manipulated.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her blonde hair was styled in a perfect chignon, and her makeup was applied with the subtle expertise of someone who had spent years learning how to present herself to maximum advantage. "I thought you might like some tea while we wait," Catherine said, her British accent lending a musical quality to her words. "The lawyers are taking longer than expected with their document review. Your father sends his apologies." She placed the tea service on the small table between the wicker chairs and began the ritual of preparation. Victoria watched her stepmother's graceful movements, noting the way Catherine's hands remained perfectly steady as she measured loose tea leaves into the elegant china pot. Everything about Catherine was controlled, calculated, perfect. It was a quality that Victoria had once admired, but had learned to find deeply unsettling. "I've asked Maria to prepare your mother's bisque recipe," Catherine continued, pouring hot water over the tea leaves with precise care. "I thought it would be nice to have something special, given the importance of today's discussions." Victoria felt a familiar stab of suspicion at the mention of her mother. Catherine rarely spoke of Elizabeth unless she was using the memory to manipulate some situation to her advantage. "What exactly are these discussions about?" Victoria asked, accepting the delicate teacup Catherine offered her. Father was rather vague on the phone. Catherine's smile never wavered, but Victoria caught a flash of something calculating in her stepmother's pale blue eyes. "Oh, just some estate planning matters. Your father is getting older, you know, and he wants to make sure everything is properly arranged for the future. There are some trust modifications to consider, some changes to the corporate structure that might affect your inheritance. Nothing too dramatic, but the lawyers insist on being thorough." The explanation sounded plausible enough, but Victoria's instincts told her there was more to the story. Catherine had never shown any interest in protecting Victoria's inheritance before. If anything, she had seemed determined to find ways to diminish it. Why the sudden concern for proper estate planning? Victoria lifted the teacup to her lips, then paused. The tea had an unusual aroma, something floral and slightly medicinal that she didn't recognize. Catherine was watching her intently, her own cup held but not yet tasted. "What kind of tea is this?" Victoria asked, lowering the cup without drinking. "Oh, it's a special blend I had sent from London," Catherine replied smoothly. "Chamomile and lavender with a few other herbs. Very soothing. I thought you might need something calming before the meeting." Something in Catherine's tone set off alarm bells in Victoria's mind. The suggestion that she needed calming, the unusual invitation to a family meeting, the sentimental gesture of her mother's recipe, the tea with its strange smell. Individual elements that might have seemed innocent but together formed a pattern that made Victoria's skin crawl with apprehension. She set the teacup down on its saucer with deliberate care, noting how Catherine's eyes followed the movement with sharp attention. "Actually, I think I'll wait for coffee with lunch," Victoria said, forcing her voice to remain casual. "I've already had quite a bit of caffeine this morning." Catherine's smile flickered almost imperceptibly, there and gone so quickly that someone who didn't know her well might have missed it entirely. But Victoria had been studying her stepmother's expressions for over a decade, learning to read the micro-expressions that revealed Catherine's true thoughts beneath her polished exterior. "Of course, dear," Catherine said, her tone still perfectly pleasant, "though the tea really is quite lovely. Perhaps just a sip to try it." The suggestion carried an undercurrent of insistence that made Victoria's pulse quicken. She was being paranoid, she told herself. Catherine might be manipulative and cold, but surely she wouldn't actually try to harm her stepdaughter. That would be crossing a line from psychological manipulation into something far darker and more dangerous. But as Victoria looked into Catherine's eyes, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Her stepmother was staring at the untouched teacup with an intensity that went far beyond normal social politeness. There was hunger in that gaze, a predatory focus that suggested Catherine had invested far more in Victoria's consumption of that particular cup of tea than simple hospitality would warrant. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the sunroom's tile floor. "Actually, I think I'll go find Maria and see if she needs any help with lunch preparation," she announced, her voice sounding artificially bright even to her own ears. Catherine rose as well, moving with liquid grace to block Victoria's path to the door. "Oh, there's no need to bother Maria," she said, her smile never wavering. "She's quite busy with the seafood preparation. Why don't you sit back down and relax? I'm sure the lawyers will be ready for us soon." But Victoria was already moving, sidestepping her stepmother with a polite but firm excuse about needing to use the restroom. Catherine made no move to physically stop her, but Victoria could feel those pale blue eyes boring into her back as she escaped from the sunroom and hurried down the hallway toward the kitchen. Her heart was pounding as she made her way through the mansion's familiar corridors, past oil paintings of stern-faced sterling ancestors, and through rooms filled with Catherine's carefully chosen antiques. She felt foolish for her suspicions, but she couldn't shake the memory of Catherine's expression when she had refused the tea. There had been something predatory there, something that suggested her stepmother had been counting on Victoria drinking from that particular cup. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smells of Maria's cooking. The housekeeper looked up from her work at the large center island, where she was carefully cleaning fresh seafood for the bisque. Her weathered face brightened with genuine pleasure at the sight of Victoria, a welcome contrast to Catherine's calculated charm. "Victoria, mi niña," Maria said, wiping her hands on her apron and moving to embrace her. "I am so happy you are here. I have been making your mama's favorite soup. Do you remember how she would sneak down to the kitchen to steal tastes while I was cooking?" Victoria returned the hug gratefully, drawing comfort from Maria's maternal warmth. "I remember," she said softly. "She said you always made it taste better than any restaurant." Maria beamed with pride at the compliment to her culinary skills, then her expression grew more serious as she studied Victoria's face. After 15 years in the Sterling household, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional undercurrents that flowed through the mansion's elegant rooms. "Something is wrong, see?" Maria asked, her accent more pronounced when she was concerned. "You look upset, worried." Victoria glanced around the kitchen, checking to make sure they were alone. The space was empty except for the two of them, but she lowered her voice anyway. Catherine had a talent for appearing unexpectedly, and Victoria didn't want to risk being overheard. "Maria," she began hesitantly, "has Catherine seemed different to you lately? More interested in family matters, maybe asking unusual questions?" Maria's dark eyes grew thoughtful as she considered the question. She had worked in wealthy households long enough to understand that the real dramas of family life often played out in subtle gestures and carefully chosen words rather than dramatic confrontations. "She has been asking about your mama's jewelry," Maria said slowly. "The pieces that are kept in the safe upstairs. She wanted to know which items were specifically left to you in the will. I told her I did not know such things, but she kept asking." Victoria felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Her mother's jewelry collection was extensive and valuable, but more importantly, it represented one of the few tangible connections Victoria had to Elizabeth's memory. Catherine had occasionally suggested that some of the pieces might look better on her, but she had never shown this level of specific interest in the inheritance details. "What else?" Victoria prompted, sensing there was more. Maria hesitated, clearly torn between her natural discretion and her concern for Victoria's well-being. "She has been meeting with men I do not know," she admitted finally. "Businessmen with briefcases and serious faces. They come to the house when your father is traveling. They talk quietly in the study, but I have heard them mention your name." The information hit Victoria like a physical blow. Catherine had been conducting private meetings about her, meetings that were kept secret from Robert. Combined with Victoria's earlier discovery of the conservatorship research, the pattern was becoming unmistakably sinister. "Has she asked you to do anything unusual?" Victoria pressed. "Any special preparations or tasks?" Maria's expression grew even more troubled. "This morning, she gave me very specific instructions for the tea service in the sunroom. She prepared the tea herself, said it was a special blend that must be served in particular cups. She was very insistent about which cup should be given to you." Victoria's blood ran cold. Her instincts had been correct. The tea had been specifically prepared for her, and Catherine had been counting on her drinking it. The implications were terrifying. What could have been in that carefully prepared cup? Drugs that might make her appear intoxicated or mentally unstable, something that would create evidence for Catherine's campaign to have her declared incompetent, or worse, Victoria realized with dawning horror. "Much worse." "Maria," she said urgently, grabbing the older woman's hands, "whatever you do, don't touch that tea service.
Don't clean those cups or drink anything that was prepared for the sunroom. Promise me." But even as she spoke the words, Victoria heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the kitchen. Someone was approaching, and from the sharp click of expensive heels on marble, she knew it was Catherine. Her stepmother had apparently grown tired of waiting and had come looking for her missing family member. Maria heard the footsteps too, and immediately understood the need for discretion. She squeezed Victoria's hands reassuringly, then moved back to her work at the kitchen island, resuming her seafood preparation with practiced efficiency. Catherine appeared in the doorway moments later, her perfect composure intact, but her eyes sharp with barely concealed irritation. "There you are," she said to Victoria with a laugh that sounded forced. "I was wondering where you had disappeared to. The lawyers are almost ready for us." Victoria forced herself to smile and nod, playing the role of the dutiful stepdaughter. "I was just saying hello to Maria and admiring her work on the bisque. It smells wonderful." "Yes, doesn't it?" Catherine agreed, her gaze moving between Victoria and Maria with calculating assessment. "Maria is such a treasure. I don't know what we would do without her." The words were spoken with Catherine's usual charming delivery, but Victoria caught the subtle undertone of threat. Maria, she realized, was as much at risk as she was. The housekeeper knew too much, cared too much, and represented too significant an obstacle to Catherine's plans. "Well," Catherine continued briskly, "we should get back to the sunroom. Your father will be joining us shortly, and it would be rude to keep the lawyers waiting." Victoria knew she had no choice but to comply, at least for the moment. She hugged Maria goodbye, whispering a quick "be careful" in the older woman's ear, then followed Catherine back through the mansion's corridors. The sunroom looked exactly as they had left it, the silver tea service still gleaming on the small table between the wicker chairs. Victoria's untouched cup sat in its saucer, the pale liquid inside grown cold during her absence. Catherine gestured for Victoria to resume her seat, then settled gracefully into her own chair. "Now then," Catherine said, reaching for the teapot, "let me refresh your tea. It must have gotten cold while we were chatting with Maria." She began to pour fresh tea into Victoria's cup, the aromatic steam rising in delicate spirals. Victoria watched the process with growing alarm, knowing she would somehow have to avoid drinking whatever Catherine was so determined to serve her. "Actually," Victoria said, standing up again, "I think I hear Father's voice in the hallway. Perhaps we should join him and the lawyers now." Catherine's hand stilled on the teapot handle. For just a moment her carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure frustration underneath. But she recovered quickly, setting the teapot down with practiced grace. "Of course," she said smoothly, "though it would be a shame to waste such lovely tea." As if summoned by their conversation, Maria appeared in the doorway carrying a small silver tray. "Pardon," she said politely, "but I brought fresh cream for the tea. I thought you might enjoy it."
Victoria watched in horror as Maria approached the table, clearly intending to be helpful by enhancing the very refreshment Victoria was desperately trying to avoid. The housekeeper reached for Victoria's cup, apparently planning to add cream to the cold tea. "No, Maria, don't," Victoria started to say. But it was too late. Maria had already lifted the delicate china cup to her lips, taking a small sip to test the temperature before adding the cream. It was a gesture born of years of perfectionist service, a housekeeper's instinct to ensure that everything served to the family met the highest standards. The effect was almost immediate. Maria's dark eyes widened in surprise, then confusion. The cup slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor in an explosion of china fragments and pale liquid. Maria swayed on her feet, one hand reaching out to steady herself against the table. "Maria," Victoria said, rushing to the older woman's side, "what's wrong?" But Maria was already falling, her knees buckling as some invisible force robbed her of the strength to stand. Victoria caught her as she collapsed, easing her down to the floor beside the broken teacup. Maria's breathing was becoming labored, and there was something strange happening to her face, a slackness around her mouth that spoke of neurological disruption. Catherine stood frozen beside her chair, her face a mask of shock that looked entirely genuine. For a moment Victoria wondered if she had been wrong about her suspicions. Perhaps there had been nothing sinister about the tea after all. Perhaps Maria was having some kind of medical emergency that had nothing to do with Catherine's carefully prepared refreshment. But then Victoria saw Maria's lips beginning to foam, a delicate white froth that gathered at the corners of her mouth, even as her breathing grew more shallow and irregular. The symptoms were unmistakable, the effects of some kind of poison working its way through the housekeeper's system with terrifying efficiency. "Call 911, Victoria shouted at Catherine, who still stood motionless beside the table. "Call an ambulance right now." But Catherine didn't move. She stood staring down at Maria with an expression that was shifting from shock to something else entirely. Victoria realized with dawning horror that her stepmother wasn't surprised by what was happening. She was disappointed. The wrong person was dying on the sunroom floor, and Catherine was calculating how to salvage her carefully laid plans. Maria's eyes found Victoria's face, and despite the poison coursing through her system, despite the weakness that was stealing her strength, the older woman managed to smile. It was a peaceful expression, one that seemed to contain years of love and protection and sacrifice. She reached up with a trembling hand to touch Victoria's cheek, her lips moving in what might have been a blessing or a warning, or simply a goodbye. "Victoria," she whispered, her voice barely audible above her labored breathing. "Your mama, she would be so proud." Those were her final words. Maria Santos, the woman who had been mother, protector, and keeper of secrets, closed her eyes and smiled as death claimed her on the marble floor of the Sterling Mansion's sunroom. She died protecting the daughter of the woman she had loved, taking into her own body the poison that had been meant for Victoria. As the reality of what had happened settled over the room, Victoria looked up to find Catherine watching her with cold, calculating eyes. Her stepmother's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the predatory intelligence beneath her polished exterior. "How terribly tragic," Catherine said, her voice devoid of genuine emotion. "Poor Maria. She must have had some kind of reaction to something. Perhaps we should call the family doctor instead of the paramedics. Dr. Richardson is so much more discreet about these kinds of domestic incidents." Victoria stared at her stepmother in disbelief, Maria's lifeless form still cradled in her arms. Catherine was already working to control the narrative, to minimize the investigation that would follow Maria's death. She wanted a tame family doctor who could be trusted to avoid asking uncomfortable questions about the circumstances surrounding the tragedy. "You killed her," Victoria said,
her voice hollow with shock and grief. "That tea was meant for me, and you killed Maria instead." Catherine's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew even colder. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said with perfect composure. "You're clearly upset by this tragic accident, and you're not thinking clearly. Perhaps you should lie down while I handle the necessary arrangements." The suggestion carried an implicit threat. Catherine was offering Victoria one last chance to play along, to accept the official story of an accidental death and pretend she hadn't seen what she had seen. If Victoria refused, if she continued to make accusations, Catherine would have no choice but to escalate her campaign to eliminate the obstacles to her plans. Victoria looked down at Maria's peaceful face, at the woman who had died saving her life, and felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. Catherine had made a fatal error. She had revealed herself too completely, shown her hand too clearly. And in killing Maria, she had eliminated the wrong threat. Victoria Sterling might have been naive about her stepmother's true nature, but she was not weak. She was her mother's daughter, with Elizabeth's strength and intelligence running through her veins. And now she had Maria's sacrifice to honor and a murder to expose. The war between them was no longer hidden beneath layers of social politeness and family obligation. Catherine had drawn first blood, and Victoria would make sure it was the last mistake her stepmother ever made. As she held Maria's lifeless body and stared into Catherine's calculating eyes, Victoria understood that everything in her life had led to this moment. The years of manipulation and psychological warfare had been preparation for this final confrontation. One of them would survive what was coming, and one of them would not. The question was whether Victoria could prove what had really happened before Catherine found another way to eliminate her permanently. The mansion around them held decades of secrets, and somewhere in its elegant rooms lay the evidence that would either save Victoria's life or seal her fate. The real battle was just beginning. The silence that followed Maria's death stretched like a taut wire between Victoria and Catherine. The paramedics had come and gone, their efficient professionalism unable to mask their confusion at the circumstances. Richardson, the family physician Catherine had insisted on calling, had arrived with his black bag and grave expression, pronouncing the death a probable heart attack brought on by some underlying condition. No mention was made of the foam at Maria's lips or the suspicious timing of her collapse. Victoria had watched it all unfold with a growing sense of unreality. The body being removed on a stretcher, the gentle questioning from the paramedics about Maria's medical history, Catherine's tearful performance as the grieving employer who had lost such a trusted member of the household staff. Through it all, her stepmother had maintained perfect composure, playing her role with the skill of a seasoned actress. Now, hours later, Victoria found herself alone in her childhood bedroom, staring at the four walls that had once represented safety and comfort, but now felt more like a prison cell. Catherine had suggested she rest, had insisted that the shock of witnessing Maria's sudden passing required quiet recuperation. The suggestion had been delivered with such apparent concern that anyone listening would have thought Catherine genuinely cared about Victoria's well-being. But Victoria knew better. She understood that Catherine needed time to clean up the loose ends, to ensure that any evidence of what had really happened in the sunroom disappeared along with Maria's body. The broken teacup had already been swept away, the remaining tea poured down the kitchen drain, the silver service polished and returned to its proper cabinet. By the time Victoria emerged from her imposed rest, there would be nothing left to prove that Maria had died from anything other than natural causes. The thought filled Victoria with a cold rage that surprised her with its intensity. She had never considered herself capable of true hatred, but as she sat in the growing darkness of her room, she felt something murderous crystallizing in her chest. Catherine had not just killed an innocent woman, she had murdered the closest thing to a mother Victoria had known since Elizabeth's death, and she had done it with the casual calculation of someone eliminating a minor inconvenience. But rage alone would not be enough to bring Catherine to justice.
Victoria needed evidence, proof that would stand up to scrutiny and expose her stepmother's true nature to the world. The problem was that Catherine had been planning this campaign for years, laying groundwork and creating alibis with the methodical patience of a master strategist. Victoria, on the other hand, was starting from nothing, armed only with her suspicions and the memory of Maria's dying smile. She needed to think like Catherine to understand the depth and complexity of her stepmother's plans. The poisoned tea had not been an impulsive act of violence. It had been part of a larger scheme, one that required careful preparation and multiple contingencies. Catherine had been meeting with unknown men, asking about jewelry and inheritance details, researching legal procedures for declaring adults incompetent. The pieces formed a pattern, but Victoria needed to understand the complete picture if she hoped to counter Catherine's next move. The first step was finding out what had happened to her father during the supposed meeting with lawyers. Victoria had not seen Robert Sterling since arriving at the mansion that morning, and his absence during the crisis with Maria struck her as deeply suspicious. Her father might be emotionally distant and easily manipulated by Catherine, but he was not heartless. He would never have stayed locked in his study while paramedics worked on a woman who had served their family faithfully for 15 years. Victoria waited until the mansion settled into its evening quiet, then slipped out of her room and made her way through the darkened corridors toward her father's study. The heavy oak door was closed, and no light showed beneath its frame. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sound of voices or movement from within, but heard only silence. The door was locked, which was unusual. Robert Sterling rarely secured his private study, preferring to trust in the discretion of his household staff and the general respect for privacy that pervaded the mansion. Victoria tested the handle several times, confirming that it would not turn, then stepped back to consider her options. The study had French doors that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking the mansion's rear gardens. If she could access the terrace from outside, she might be able to determine whether her father was actually inside or whether Catherine's story about the lawyers' meeting had been another fabrication. Victoria made her way downstairs and through the mansion's rear entrance, stepping out onto the formal gardens that had been her mother's pride and joy. The October air was crisp and carried the scent of dying leaves and dormant flower beds. Moonlight filtered through the bare branches of the oak trees, casting shifting shadows across the carefully manicured lawns. The study's French doors were dark, their heavy curtains drawn against the night. Victoria approached carefully, staying in the shadows cast by an ornamental hedge, and peered through a gap in the drapery. The room beyond was empty, its furniture draped in protective covers that suggested it had not been used for some time. Her father was not in his study. There had been no meeting with lawyers, no urgent estate planning discussions that required his immediate attention. Catherine's entire story had been a lie designed to lure Victoria to the mansion and isolate her from potential witnesses. The realization sent a chill down Victoria's spine. If Catherine was willing to fabricate elaborate scenarios to achieve her goals, what other deceptions had she orchestrated? Victoria returned to the mansion through the kitchen entrance, her mind racing with implications. She needed to find concrete evidence of Catherine's plans, documentation that would prove her stepmother's criminal intentions. The most likely place to start was Catherine's private office, a small but elegant room on the mansion's second floor that her stepmother used for personal correspondence and financial management. The office was located directly above the main library, accessible through a narrow hallway that connected the guest bedrooms to the mansion's east wing. Victoria had rarely entered the space during Catherine's tenure as mistress of the house, but she remembered it as a feminine counterpoint to Robert's more masculine study, decorated in soft pastels and filled with delicate antiques. The door to Catherine's office was also locked, but this presented less of a challenge than her father's study. Victoria remembered that Elizabeth had kept a spare key hidden in a small decorative box on a nearby hall table, a precaution from the days when the room had served as her mother's private retreat. Catherine might have changed the lock, but Victoria doubted her stepmother would have thought to search for hidden keys left by the previous Mrs. Sterling.
The key was still there, nestled beneath a collection of silk flowers that had probably not been disturbed in years. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she inserted it into the lock, half expecting it to fail to turn. But the mechanism opened smoothly, suggesting that Catherine had indeed never bothered to change the hardware. The office was dark and carried the faint scent of Catherine's expensive perfume, a sophisticated blend of jasmine and sandalwood that had become associated in Victoria's mind with manipulation and deceit. She closed the door softly behind her and felt along the wall for a light switch, then thought better of it. If Catherine returned to the mansion unexpectedly, a lighted window might alert her to Victoria's presence. Instead, Victoria used the flashlight function on her cell phone, keeping the beam low and directing it away from the windows. The office looked much as she remembered it, furnished with a delicate writing desk, a small bookshelf, and several comfortable chairs arranged around a tea table. But Catherine had added her own touches, including filing cabinets and a modern computer setup that suggested the room served more practical purposes than casual correspondence. Victoria began her search with the desk drawers, looking for anything that might shed light on Catherine's recent activities. The top drawer contained the usual assortment of pens, stationery, and office supplies. The second drawer held financial documents related to household expenses and charitable donations, nothing that seemed relevant to Victoria's investigation. But the bottom drawer was locked with a small brass mechanism that required a separate key. Victoria searched through the other drawers, hoping to find the key hidden in some obvious location, but came up empty. She was about to abandon the desk and move to the filing cabinets when she noticed a small leather portfolio lying open on the desktop. The portfolio contained several documents that made Victoria's blood run cold. There were copies of psychological evaluations dating back several years, reports that painted Victoria as increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous to herself and others. The evaluations were signed by Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a psychiatrist Victoria had never met and certainly never been examined by. According to the reports, Victoria had been displaying signs of severe depression, anxiety, and possible dissociative episodes. There were detailed accounts of erratic behavior, including alleged incidents of self-harm and substance abuse that Victoria knew were complete fabrications. The most recent evaluation, dated just 2 weeks earlier, recommended immediate psychiatric intervention and suggested that Victoria posed a significant risk to herself and others if left unsupervised. The implications were staggering. Catherine had been creating a false medical history for Victoria, building a paper trail that would support a legal petition for guardianship or conservatorship.
The conversation was too distant to make out specific words, but the tone suggested a business discussion rather than a social visit. After a few minutes, Victoria heard footsteps on the main staircase, followed by the sound of doors closing in different parts of the mansion. Victoria waited another 10 minutes before carefully opening the office door and peering into the hallway. The corridor was dark and empty, but she could see light seeping from beneath Catherine's bedroom door at the far end of the wing. Her stepmother was apparently settling in for the night, which gave Victoria the opportunity to escape undetected. She locked the office door and returned the key to its hiding place, then made her way back to her own room through the mansion's labyrinthine corridors. Her mind was spinning with everything she had discovered, and she needed time to process the implications and plan her next steps. The evidence she had found was compelling, but potentially fragile. Catherine had clearly invested years in creating her elaborate deception, and she would not hesitate to destroy evidence if she suspected Victoria had discovered her plans. Victoria needed to secure her findings and get them into the hands of someone who could take appropriate action, but she also needed to be careful about who she trusted. Catherine had demonstrated an extraordinary ability to manipulate authority figures and create false narratives that served her interests. The family doctor had been easily convinced to sign a fraudulent death certificate. How many other professionals might be compromised or susceptible to Catherine's influence? Victoria spent the rest of the night researching her options, using her phone to look up information about forensic toxicology, legal procedures for challenging fraudulent documents, and resources for victims of sophisticated financial crimes. She also began documenting everything she could remember about Catherine's behavior over the years, creating a timeline of suspicious incidents and manipulation tactics. As dawn broke over the Connecticut countryside, Victoria had formulated a preliminary plan. She would need to leave the mansion as soon as possible and get the evidence into the hands of law enforcement officials who had no prior relationship with the Sterling family. But first she needed to secure the most critical piece of evidence, the vial of oleander extract that could directly link Catherine to Maria's murder. Victoria waited until she heard sounds of morning activity from the kitchen staff before making her move. Catherine typically spent her mornings in her private suite, attending to correspondence and personal grooming before emerging for a late breakfast. This routine would give Victoria a narrow window of opportunity to return to the office and retrieve the vial. She made her way through the mansion's corridors, moving carefully to avoid detection by the household staff who would be beginning their daily routines. The office door was still locked, and the key remained in its hiding place, suggesting that Catherine had not discovered Victoria's midnight investigation. But when Victoria opened the hidden compartment in the desk, her heart sank. The vial of oleander extract was gone, along with all the other incriminating documents she had photographed the night before. In their place was a single sheet of elegant stationery, bearing a brief message in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. "My dear Victoria," the note read, "I had hoped we could continue our arrangement with mutual respect and discretion. However, your nocturnal curiosity has forced me to accelerate our timeline considerably. Please join me in the conservatory at your earliest convenience. We have much to discuss, and I'm afraid our conversation can no longer be postponed. Yours truly, Catherine." Victoria stared at the note, her mind racing with the implications. Catherine knew about her investigation, had somehow discovered that Victoria had found the evidence of her criminal conspiracy. But how was that possible? Victoria had been careful to return everything to its original position, had locked the office and hidden the key exactly as she had found it. The answer came to her with a sickening realization. The office must have been equipped with some kind of surveillance system, hidden cameras that allowed Catherine to monitor anyone who entered her private space. Victoria's entire investigation had been observed and recorded, turning what she had thought was a secret advantage into a devastating liability. Catherine now knew that Victoria possessed concrete evidence of her plans, which meant that the facade of step-family harmony could finally be dropped. The gloves were coming off, and Victoria found herself facing a woman who had already committed murder, and who had nothing left to lose by escalating the conflict. The conservatory was located at the rear of the mansion, a glass-enclosed garden room that had been Elizabeth's favorite space for cultivating exotic plants and orchids. Catherine had maintained the space after Elizabeth's death, but she had gradually replaced her predecessor's delicate flowering plants with more dramatic specimens that reflected her own aesthetic preferences. Victoria made her way to the conservatory with growing trepidation, knowing that she was walking into a confrontation that would determine the course of her future, and quite possibly whether she had any future at all. Catherine had already shown her willingness to commit murder to achieve her goals. There was no reason to believe she would hesitate to eliminate Victoria now that her stepdaughter posed a direct threat to her plans. The conservatory's glass doors were standing open, allowing the morning sunlight to stream into the plant-filled space. Catherine stood near the center of the room, dressed in an elegant cream-colored suit that made her look like a fashionable botanist conducting research among her specimens. She turned as Victoria entered, offering the same perfectly composed smile she had worn throughout their years of coexistence. "Victoria, darling," Catherine said warmly, as if they were meeting for nothing more significant than morning tea. "Thank you for joining me so promptly. I was just admiring your mother's orchid collection. She had such exquisite taste in exotic varieties."
Victoria remained near the doorway, every instinct warning her to maintain distance from her stepmother. "You wanted to discuss something," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Catherine nodded graciously, moving to tend to a particularly striking orchid with deep purple blooms. "Indeed I do. It seems we've reached a point where complete honesty is required between us. Your little exploration last night was quite thorough, though perhaps not as secretive as you imagined." She gestured toward a small camera hidden among the conservatory's hanging plants, so well concealed that Victoria would never have noticed it without having it pointed out. "I've had security measures in place throughout the mansion for quite some time. One can never be too careful when managing valuable assets and sensitive information." Victoria felt her stomach drop as she realized the full extent of Catherine's preparation and surveillance. Her stepmother had been watching her, recording her movements and conversations, building a comprehensive understanding of potential threats to her plans. The entire Sterling household had been turned into a carefully monitored environment where privacy was an illusion and genuine safety was impossible. "You killed Maria," Victoria said, abandoning any pretense of uncertainty or diplomacy. "You poisoned the tea that was meant for me, and she died because she was trying to protect me." Catherine's expression didn't change, but she nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Poor Maria was indeed collateral damage in a larger strategy. "I had hoped to avoid such complications, but she had become increasingly protective of you and suspicious of my activities. Her removal was always going to be necessary eventually." The casual way Catherine discussed Maria's murder sent a chill through Victoria's entire body. Her stepmother spoke about ending a human life as if it were a minor administrative task, an inconvenient but manageable aspect of her larger agenda. "What larger strategy?" Victoria demanded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Catherine set down the small watering can she had been using and turned to face Victoria directly. Her mask of pleasant sociability had finally fallen away completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "My dear girl," Catherine said, her voice carrying a note of condescending patience, "surely you understand that this was never about personal animosity or petty family drama. You represent a significant obstacle to the proper management of Sterling family assets, and obstacles must be removed efficiently and permanently." She began moving closer to Victoria, her steps measured and deliberate. "Your father has been very cooperative in recent years, particularly after I helped him understand that your emotional instability posed a threat to the family's reputation and financial interests. With the proper medical documentation and legal framework in place, your removal from the inheritance equation would have been entirely legitimate and legally unassailable." Victoria backed toward the conservatory's entrance, but Catherine continued her advance with predatory patience. "Unfortunately, your survival of yesterday's incident has created complications that require more direct solutions. The fabricated psychiatric evaluations and will modifications are no longer sufficient to achieve our objectives." "Our objectives?" Victoria asked, stalling for time while she tried to determine her best escape route. Catherine smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth for the first time in years. "Oh yes, my dear. Your father and I have been working together on this project for quite some time. He may not have known the specific methods I employed, but he was fully aware of the ultimate goal. Robert Sterling is a businessman above all else, and he understands that sentiment cannot be allowed to interfere with practical necessity." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her father, the distant but generally benevolent figure she had spent her life trying to please, had been complicit in Catherine's campaign to eliminate her from the family.
He polished shoes in silence, watching the world from beneath lowered eyes. Each buffed leather surface reflected stories of power and privilege, until one dropped receipt revealed corruption that would bring an empire to its knees. "You can make this much easier on everyone by accepting a similar arrangement. The medication will produce a peaceful, painless unconsciousness that will allow me to stage an appropriate accident. Your death will be attributed to the same mental instability that has been documented in your psychiatric evaluations, a tragic but predictable outcome that will generate sympathy rather than suspicion. Victoria realized that she was trapped in the same impossible situation that had claimed her mother's life 20 years earlier. Catherine was offering her a choice between cooperation and resistance, but the outcome would be the same either way. Her stepmother had spent years planning this confrontation and had prepared for every possible contingency. But Victoria also understood something that Catherine might have underestimated. She was not the fragile, isolated teenager her stepmother had been manipulating for the past decade. She was Elizabeth Sterling's daughter, with her mother's intelligence and strength running through her veins. And she had Maria's sacrifice to honor, a debt that could only be repaid by exposing the truth about the woman who had destroyed their family. Victoria began moving sideways along the conservatory's glass wall, trying to create distance between herself and Catherine while avoiding the trap of being cornered. "You made one critical mistake," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror coursing through her system. Catherine raised an eyebrow inquisitively, but kept the syringe ready for immediate use. "And what might that be, darling?" "You assumed I would be as isolated and helpless as my mother was," Victoria replied, reaching into her jacket pocket and withdrawing her cell phone. "But I documented everything I found in your office last night. The photographs, the evidence, the connections between your activities and Maria's death. All of it has been uploaded to a secure server and shared with multiple recipients who will take action if anything happens to me." Catherine's expression shifted slightly, the first sign of uncertainty Victoria had seen in her stepmother's demeanor. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice carried a note of doubt. Victoria held up her phone, showing Catherine the screen with its list of sent messages and uploaded files. Detective Sarah Morrison with the Connecticut State Police, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, District Attorney Michael Chen. 3 different investigative journalists who specialize in exposing corporate corruption and family crimes. They all have copies of everything I found, along with detailed timelines and analysis of your activities. The color began draining from Catherine's face as she realized the implications. Her carefully constructed plan had depended on controlling the narrative and limiting the investigation to local authorities who could be influenced or manipulated. But Victoria had bypassed those vulnerabilities by reaching out to state and federal agencies with no prior connection to the Sterling family. Furthermore, Victoria continued, gaining confidence as she saw Catherine's composure beginning to crack. "Maria's body is being exhumed today for a complete toxicological analysis. The medical examiner was very interested in my description of her symptoms and the circumstances surrounding her death. They're specifically testing for oleander poisoning, among other things." This was partially true. Victoria had contacted the medical examiner's office early that morning, before coming to the conservatory, and had provided them with detailed information about Maria's death. But the exhumation order was still pending approval, and the toxicology tests might take weeks to complete. Catherine stood frozen for a long moment, the syringe still in her hand but her entire plan collapsing around her. She had spent years building her conspiracy on the assumption that she could control every variable and eliminate every threat. But Victoria's escape from isolation had created a cascade of exposure that could not be contained or managed through traditional methods. "You have destroyed everything," Catherine said finally, her voice filled with a cold fury that was more frightening than any threat she had made. "Do you understand what you have done? The Sterling family reputation, the business relationships, the political connections that took generations to build. All of it will be swept away by your need for revenge." Victoria felt a surge of satisfaction at seeing her stepmother's mask finally slip completely. "Good," she said simply. "A family built on murder and fraud doesn't deserve to survive."
Catherine's grip tightened on the syringe, and for a moment, Victoria thought her stepmother might abandon all pretense of self-preservation and attempt one final act of violence. But then they both heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the mansion's driveway, followed by the distinctive sound of car doors slamming and authoritative voices calling instructions. Victoria's contacts had moved faster than she had dared to hope. The authorities were arriving to investigate her claims and arrest Catherine for murder and conspiracy. Her stepmother's reign of terror was finally coming to an end, and the truth about the Sterling family's dark secrets would finally be exposed to the light of justice. Detective Sarah Morrison stepped through the conservatory's glass doors with the measured confidence of someone who had arrested hundreds of suspects over her 15-year career. She was a compact woman in her early 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the scene before her. Behind her came two uniformed officers and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as FBI Special Agent David Chen. Catherine Sterling stood motionless among the orchids, the syringe still clutched in her right hand, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. She looked every inch the wronged society matron, a woman of refinement and breeding who had been subjected to unspeakable accusations by an unstable family member. Only the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the desperation beneath her composed exterior. Victoria remained pressed against the conservatory's glass wall, her cell phone still visible in her grip, the evidence of her communications with law enforcement clear to everyone present. She felt a wave of relief so intense, it left her momentarily dizzy. The authorities had arrived in time. Catherine's decades-long campaign of manipulation and murder was finally coming to an end. Mrs. Sterling, Detective Morrison addressed Catherine with professional courtesy. "I'm going to need you to place that syringe on the ground and step away from it slowly." Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the medical instrument for a moment, and Victoria tensed, wondering if her stepmother might attempt one final act of violence. But then Catherine's social conditioning reasserted itself, the ingrained habits of a lifetime spent managing her public image. She placed the syringe carefully on a nearby potting bench and stepped back with fluid grace. "Detective," Catherine said, her British accent lending an air of wounded dignity to her words, "I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding. My stepdaughter has been struggling with severe mental health issues for years, and I fear she has created an elaborate fantasy to explain her deteriorating psychological condition." Agent Chen stepped forward, removing a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Mrs. Sterling, you're under arrest for the murder of Maria Santos, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud related to falsified medical documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the federal agent recited Catherine's Miranda rights, Victoria watched her stepmother's face carefully. She expected to see rage, fear, or desperation as the reality of her situation became undeniable. Instead, Catherine's expression remained eerily calm, as if she were observing someone else's arrest rather than experiencing her own downfall. "I will, of course, cooperate fully with your investigation," Catherine said as the handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists. "Though I believe you will find that the evidence supports a very different narrative than the one my poor stepdaughter has constructed in her troubled mind." Detective Morrison exchanged a glance with Agent Chen, both investigators recognizing the tone of someone who believed they still held cards to play. Catherine Sterling might be under arrest, but she clearly had not abandoned hope of controlling the narrative and managing the outcome of the legal proceedings. "Mrs. Sterling," Detective Morrison said firmly, "we've already begun preliminary testing on tissue samples from Maria Santos' body." She broke down during her first police interview, confessing to years of complicity in Catherine's scheme and providing additional evidence about the extent of the conspiracy. The media attention was intense and overwhelming.
The Sterling family name, which had been synonymous with respectability and success for 3 generations, became associated with murder, fraud, and betrayal. News crews camped outside the family mansion, business partners distanced themselves from Sterling Industries, and society acquaintances who had once courted Catherine's favor suddenly developed selective amnesia about their relationships with the family. Victoria found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, portrayed alternately as a heroic whistleblower who had exposed a decades-long criminal conspiracy, and as a troubled heiress whose psychological problems had destroyed a respected family. She gave no interviews and made no public statements, preferring to let the legal system work through the evidence and reach its own conclusions. 3 weeks after Catherine's arrest, Victoria received word that her father had been located in a private psychiatric facility in Switzerland, where he had been receiving treatment for what his doctors described as a complete nervous breakdown. Robert Sterling had apparently suffered a psychological collapse shortly after learning the full extent of Catherine's plans, unable to reconcile his complicity in the conspiracy with his residual feelings for his daughter. Victoria flew to Switzerland to visit him, unsure of what she would find or how she would react to seeing the man who had agreed to her elimination for the sake of financial convenience. The psychiatric facility was an elegant, discreet institution nestled in the Alps, the kind of place where wealthy families sent relatives whose problems required more than conventional therapy could provide. Her father looked decades older than when she had last seen him, his hair completely white and his frame diminished by weight loss and obvious emotional trauma. He sat in the facility's sunroom, staring out at the snow-covered mountains with the vacant expression of someone whose internal world had collapsed entirely. "Victoria," he said when she approached, his voice hollow and uncertain, "you came." She sat down across from him, studying the broken man who bore little resemblance to the powerful businessman who had once commanded respect in boardrooms around the world. "I needed to understand," she said simply. "I needed to hear from you what really happened and why you allowed Catherine to do what she did." Robert Sterling closed his eyes, and for a moment Victoria thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I loved your mother more than anything in the world," he said. "When she died, I thought it was an accident. A tragic, senseless accident that took away the only person who had ever made me truly happy." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Victoria for the first time since she had arrived. "Catherine told me the truth about Elizabeth's death gradually, over a period of years. She revealed how she had manipulated the medication, how she had created the conditions for the riding accident. She said she did it to protect me, to prevent your mother from destroying the family with her instability and her threats to expose certain business practices." Victoria felt a familiar surge of rage at the mention of her mother's murder, but she forced herself to remain calm and listen to her father's explanation. "Why didn't you turn her in? Why didn't you go to the police when you learned what she had done?" Robert laughed bitterly, the sound carrying no trace of humor. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I had built my entire identity around the Sterling family name and reputation, and I couldn't face the scandal that would come with exposing Catherine's crimes. She convinced me that Elizabeth's death was in the past, that nothing could be gained by revealing the truth about what had happened." He paused, staring out at the mountains again, "But she also made it clear that my cooperation was not optional. Catherine had documented evidence of my involvement in certain questionable business dealings, financial arrangements that could have resulted in criminal charges if they became public. She owned me completely, and she used that leverage to ensure my compliance with her plans." Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions as she processed her father's confession. Part of her wanted to hate him for his weakness and complicity, for choosing financial security over justice for her mother. But another part recognized that he too had been a victim of Catherine's manipulation, trapped in a web of blackmail and psychological control that had ultimately destroyed him. "When she told you about her plans for me," Victoria said, "when she explained that I needed to be eliminated, how did you justify that to yourself?" Robert Sterling's face crumpled as if he were experiencing physical pain. "I told myself that it would be quick and painless, that you wouldn't suffer, Catherine assured me that she would make it look like a suicide brought on by mental illness, that your death would be seen as a tragedy rather than a crime. I convinced myself that sacrificing you was necessary to protect the family legacy and prevent even greater harm to more people." He looked at Victoria with eyes full of self-loathing and regret. "But the truth is, I was weak and selfish. I chose my own comfort and security over my daughter's life. I failed you and I failed your mother, and I will carry that guilt with me until the day I die." Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, processing the weight of her father's confession and trying to determine how she felt about his role in Catherine's conspiracy. She had come to Switzerland expecting to confront a villain, but instead she found a broken man whose moral failures had been exposed and whose psychological defenses had completely collapsed under the weight of his guilt. "The doctors here say you're not competent to stand trial," she said finally. "They believe your breakdown is genuine and that you're not capable of participating in your own defense." Robert nodded slowly. "Catherine's final victory," he said. "She destroyed me so completely that I can't even face the consequences of my actions. I'll spend whatever time I have left in places like this, a living ghost haunted by the choices I made." Victoria stood up from her chair, looking down at the man who had been her father and recognizing that their relationship, such as it had been, was effectively over. "I forgive you," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I refuse to let Catherine's poison continue to destroy what's left of our family. But I can't pretend that we can have any kind of relationship after this. Too much has been broken, and some things can't be repaired." Robert Sterling nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I understand," he whispered. "I hope someday you can find peace, Victoria. I hope you can build a life that isn't haunted by the choices your parents made." Victoria left the psychiatric facility that afternoon and flew back to the United States, feeling as if she were leaving behind not just her father but the entire Sterling family legacy. The weight of generations, the expectations and obligations that had defined her identity for 26 years, fell away as the Alps disappeared beneath the aircraft's wings. Catherine's trial began 6 months later, generating headlines around the world as prosecutors presented evidence of a conspiracy that spanned decades and multiple victims. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, built on physical evidence, financial records, and testimony from co-conspirators who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Victoria testified for 3 days, walking the jury through her discovery of Catherine's plans and her investigation into Maria's murder. She spoke about her mother's death and her growing understanding of the systematic way Catherine had eliminated obstacles to her control over the Sterling family fortune. Catherine's defense team argued that their client was a victim of circumstances, a woman who had married into a family with dark secrets and had been forced to take extreme measures to protect herself and her husband from exposure. They portrayed Victoria as an unstable young woman whose psychological problems had led her to construct elaborate fantasies about her stepmother's supposed crimes. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The oleander extract found in Catherine's office, the falsified medical records, the financial manipulations, the recorded communications with Dr. Thornfield, all combined to paint a picture of premeditated murder and systematic fraud that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away.